Should we get started?
Yes.
Sounds like people are here. So I wrote an introduction for Vincent. I just thought it was something that needed to be written out at a little bit of length. So I hope people will not mind it that much because it's a little bit longer than a typical introduction. I think it seemed like it was important to not just kind of introduce your research, but also to kind of talk a little bit about who you are and what your presence at Lehigh has been like over the past few years, and kind of, in a sense, celebrate as opposed to simply critique. I hope you don't feel embarrassed by it.
No.
Okay. So first of all, it's an understatement to say that Vincent Walsh brought with him a wealth of experience and knowledge, especially about the struggle for social justice in North America, that impacted the final project that he's written. As a person who was active in the 1960s protests for civil rights and against the Vietnam War, he's been invested in these issues for a very, very long time. By contrast, though, I was technically in the position of being one of Vincent's academic advisors in this process. I had as much to learn from Vincent about some of these issues as he did for me, Betsy, Seth, and Matt. And earlier, Addison Bross, who's now recently retired, was also involved in the project. Vincent also spent much of his adult life before coming to Lehigh working with underprivileged inner city students. Though he's much older than myself, indeed, he completes his PhD at the age where many people might be thinking about retiring, or at least slowing down, which I don't think he is. He has brought a remarkable energy and discipline to his work. I hope I have half as much of that passion when I reach Vincent's age. It's been both incredibly rewarding but also challenging, being honest, to work with Vincent over the past few years. I believe his first class with me was in fall 2008, a grad seminar called Theory and Anti-Theory, which I named on purpose to provoke controversy, which I would not actually do again, but I tried it. Many of
It was a good course.
Was it? The course of owls did not show that. Anyway, many of the theoretical arguments Vincent brings to the table in the current dissertation, his critique of postmodernist irony, the post-structuralist orientation of the science system, were also ideas he expressed in papers that he wrote in that class. He also took a course later with me on travel writing in the spring of 2009, where he wrote papers on books like Joseph Conrad's Lord Jim and Taib Salih's Season of Migration to the North. I believe his interest in going in a post-colonial direction in his dissertation started around that time, though I suspect his interest emerged as much as a result of Betsy Pfeiffer's influence as my own. During the years he was teaching English 1 and 2, and in the Peace Studies program at Lehigh, Vincent put himself heart and soul into his teaching. His approach was fundamentally student-centered, oriented towards having students own their own writing by having them read and discuss each other's work aloud in virtually every single class. He also didn't hesitate to bring his own views about social justice before the students that he taught. I sat in on a class session a few years ago that he was doing and was impressed to see how open and democratic the class felt. His approach has informed my own teaching style in recent years, as I've implemented a somewhat modified version of the same structure in my own first-year writing courses, as well as the experimental course I teach called Writing for the Internet. Vincent's choice of dissertation topic might seem somewhat unusual. Junot Diaz is a relatively young author who has published only 3 books, of which 2 are collections of short stories, and the third, the hugely successful and popular novel, The Brief, Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award, as well as the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2008. It's unusual to focus somewhat exclusively on a single author in the present era, and even more so on one who is still in the first leg of his career. But Diaz's work brings together several different issues in contemporary literature in some really remarkable and provocative ways. It is at once a highly accomplished work of immigrant American fiction, and a work that, with its striking use of hip-hop slang, contributes to the idiom of African-American literature. Further, insofar as we see Oscar Wilde as a Dominican novel, it is also at once a work of American literature and a work of post-colonial literature at the same time, concerned with the impact of European imperialism, the history of the slave trade, and the question of cultural identity in the post-colonial Caribbean. And of course, it is saturated with science fiction and fantasy geek references, aggressively blurring the boundary between high literary historical reference points and popular culture. Vincent's work manages to look at the novel through these various different lenses. He contrasts Diaz's work to the work of other Dominican-American novelists like Julia Alvarez, who Vincent argues scarcely mentions race or the problem of colorism internal to Dominican society. He also contrasts Diaz to other Latin American novelists in the dictator novel tradition who have addressed the history and legacy of Rafael Trujillo, again showing that what Diaz is doing is different and more historically expansive. And he traces out some of the science fiction and comic book allusions in the book as well. I'm about to wrap up here. As a rhetorically complex novel, taking an often ironic and playful tone even while writing about grave historical atrocities, the present project gives Vincent a chance to explore the status and function of postmodernist American fiction. Can postmodernist techniques such as are rampantly in evidence in Diaz's work be put in the service of a critique of the many different forms of violence employed by the Trujillo and Balaguer regimes in the Dominican Republic? Or is postmodernism primarily a discourse that aims to question the strength of simple and effective assertions about the historical record? Though we have often discussed the intricacies of contemporary theory, and he and I may continue to differ on some points in this respect, I believe Vincent is on the right track in his reading of Oscar Wilde. The obsessive desire to control the master narrative of Dominican history demonstrated by Trujillo is precisely the kind of totalizing approach to the inscribing of history that postmodernist techniques like self-reflexivity, metafictional asides, and the embrace of the anti-heroic posture can aim to challenge. Right? So its social justice kind of credentials and its postmodernism are aligned. After Vincent's, so that's about it for introducing Vincent's work. Vincent as a person a little bit. After his presentation, he's going to talk for a little while and introduce his project on his own words. We're going to encourage questions from the audience as well as from examiners. And it is an informal process. It's not a defense in the kind of classic model at all. It really is a chance for us to discuss Vincent's work. If you have things you have to say about Oscar Wilde, questions that you want to raise. I know a couple of people in the room were in a class where we taught, actually one person was in the room where we talked about Oscar Wilde in the fall. We'll aim for that. And there's also cookies and there's also some iced tea floating around, so please feel free to help yourself to some refreshments. So with that, let me turn it over to Vincent and we'll hear more about his project. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I wrote a formal presentation just to give some background about the dissertation, and we'll get into a conversation. But before I do that, I just want to mention that the acknowledgement section took a lot of time to write. It's really important to me. And apart from my committee, who's been outstanding, I mean, Deep, Betsy, Seth, and Matt, they're very supportive. At the same time, they put my feet to the fire in terms of my work. They always did it in a very loving, encouraging, supportive way. And brought out the best of what I can offer at this point. I'll be eternally grateful for that. And I also want to thank Heather, who helped me put this manuscript together. I never would have done this. We finished at 5 minutes to 2. And Vivian, you know, as far as I'm concerned, Vivian steals the heart and soul of this English department. So thank you. And Michelle, you know, my dear friend who's a teacher in Nazareth, wonderful, wonderful work with young kids, and she's a constant inspiration to me because she proves to me that, and my committee has proven to me, and Vivian and Heather have proven to me that, and Diaz is talking about this too, the only thing that's going to save us in the near term is reawakening the spirit of human love, and human family, and human solidarity. And I want to mention Katie also, Katie Hewell, who was in my Fam Jam class, freshman English, back in, 2010, 2011. And then as a freshman, became effectively a teaching assistant for the Peace Studies class the following semester, 55 students, and she managed the entire thing and set up a Facebook page, and she was doing outstanding work as a junior here at Lehigh, winning awards. Really proud of it. Carry on, right? What appealed to me most in my initial encounter with the brief wondrous life of Oscar Wilde was the playful irreverence and provocative cadence of the poetically sculpted prose, along with the sardonic, streetwise humor with which Junot Diaz approaches everyday romance, as well as heart-wrenching tragedy. We are introduced to a chronically frustrated, girl-crazy protagonist who spends maddening hours like a eunuch in a harem in the tantalizing company of his older sister's stunning college friends. Her girls were not too smart, but they were fine as shit. The sort of hot as balls Latinas who only dated weightlifting Morenos or Latino cats with guns in their cribs. They were all on the volleyball team together, and tall and fit as colts. And when they went for runs, it was what the track team might have looked like in terrorist heaven. I read this novel 6, 7 times, I think 8 times, and I still laugh out loud when I read it. Oscar falls hopelessly in love with Maritza Chacon, the flyest guapa in Patterson, one of the queens of the New Peru. He watched Maritza from afar, convinced that one day when the nuclear bombs fell, or the plague broke out, or the tripods invaded, and civilization was wiped out, he would end up saving her from a pack of irradiated ghouls, and together they set out across the ravaged America in search of a better tomorrow. In these apocalyptic daydreams, he was always some kind of Latino Doc Savage, a super genius who combined world-class martial artistry with deadly firearms proficiency. Not bad for a nigger who had never even shot an air rifle, thrown a punch, or scored higher than 1,000 on his SATs. Oscar's sister Lola describes a painfully conflicted relationship with a mother who has suffered more than her share of trauma and sorrow, including an unwinnable battle with breast cancer, in whom Lola expresses a strangely twisted yet profoundly moving love. But God, how we fought. Sick or not, dying or not, my mother wasn't going to go down easily. She wasn't una pendeja. I'd seen her slap grown men, push white police officers onto their asses, curse a whole group of bochinera. She had raised me and my brother by herself. She had worked 3 jobs until she could buy this house we live in. She had survived being abandoned by my father. She had come from Santo Domingo all by herself, and as a young girl, she claimed to have been beaten, set on fire, left for dead. There was no way she was going to let me go without killing me first. When Lola leaves Belly sprawling on a Jersey Shore boardwalk and sees her chance at last to escape her mother's tenacious grasp, the bond of family affection proves far too powerful to sever. I wasn't going to stop. I was going to fly. Anyway, that's how it should have worked out. But I look back, I couldn't help it. It's not like I didn't know my Bible, all that pillar of salt stuff. But when you're someone's daughter that she raised by herself with no help from nobody, habits die hard. I just wanted to make sure my mom hadn't broken her arm or cracked open her skull. I mean, really, who the hell wants to kill their own mother by accident? That's the only reason I glanced back. She was sprawled on the ground, her wig had fallen out of reach, her poor bald head out in the day like something private and shameful, and she was bawling like a lost calf. But then when I reached down to help her, she clamped on me with both hands. She hadn't been crying at all. She'd been faking. Her smile was like a lion's. "Ya te tengo," she said, jumping triumphantly to her feet. "Te tengo." The opening sentence of the novel, "The shade came first from Africa," carried in the screams of the enslaved, warns readers that we are about to embark on a Dantean journey through imperial colonial hell. We are being invited to visit the dread underworld of contemporary civilization, the dark side of progress that is kept deliberately hidden, carefully disguised from public consciousness by deceptive official rhetoric. Diaz's introduction to the pervasive theme of the Fuku, a mysterious curse that has stalked the New World down through the centuries ever since Columbus, is couched in pervasive irony that seems both self-undermining and at the same time deadly serious. This vague notion of a baleful bane plaguing the Western Hemisphere and the modern world generally covers a wide spectrum of human misfortune, from last night's case of mild indigestion to a global superpower's military debacle in Southeast Asia, along with the shocking assassination of a US president. The prefatory mention of slavery, along with the corollary reference to the death bane of the Taínos, confronts us with historical background in the Caribbean that has been consistently suppressed in mainstream Western discourse. School children in the United States are encouraged to regard Christopher Columbus as an intrepid, heroic explorer who supposedly discovered the New World, as if the tens of millions of people who have been flourishing here for thousands of years simply never existed or cannot be regarded as fully human. According to classroom textbooks, Columbus opened up primitive, eagerly receptive regions of the Western Hemisphere to the material benefits and spiritual blessings of Europe's advanced, beneficent civilization. Yet close examination of the scholarly record reveals a radically different account of what actually transpired after Columbus's landing on Hispaniola. David Standard maintains that Native Americans had already developed a level of civilization that was, in many respects, markedly superior to Europe's by the time Columbus appeared on the scene, especially with regard to achievements in social organization, public health, gender equality, agricultural development, and egalitarian harmony. The one area where native populations lagged behind the Europeans was in military technology, along with the ruthless willingness to engage in indiscriminate slaughter for the sake of accumulating private wealth. It is difficult to reconcile honest scrutiny of the systematic genocide practiced by the conquistadors, a calculated policy of wholesale extermination that was enforced with even greater ruthlessness by European settlers in the northern colonies, and the brutalities of the slave trade that served as the foundation for explosive economic growth throughout the hemisphere for the next several hundred years, with the prevailing sense of complacent self-approval that touts our contemporary corporatized society, particularly as it manifests in the United States, Canada, and Western Europe, as the apex of human progress, an exemplar of Fukuyama's so-called end of history. We know, if we care to look, that as many as 100 million human beings inhabited the Western Hemisphere at the time of Columbus's arrival, and that within just a single century, approximately 90% of that number had already expired due to disease, overwork, and outright slaughter, making the European incursion into the New World the most egregious example of ethnic cleansing in recorded history. We are also forced to admit, if we dare to acknowledge the facts, that comparable and even greater numbers of people have died ignominiously and needlessly just in the past half-century alone, since the end of World War II, due to the heartless policies of the updated version of essentially the same genocidal ideology that motivated the conquistadors, justifying an economic system that prioritizes ruthless greed and the acquisition of riches over all other considerations, including the sustainability of life itself. The same toxic mentality that rationalized the annihilation of Native Americans and enslavement of Africans now leaves 1 billion human beings either severely malnourished or slowly starving across the globe, with countless millions more dying each year from easily treatable illnesses or killed in deliberately incited internecine conflicts, while ongoing exploitation of natural resources wreaks devastating havoc on the environment, and lethal economic competition brings humanity ever closer to the brink of calamitous nuclear war. Capitalist ideology in its contemporary neoliberal form produces such extreme economic disparities that 4/5 of the human population is now considered extraneous and therefore expendable. In his one novel and 2 volumes of short fiction published so far, Junot Diaz paints a stark and painful picture of the brutal realities of rural poverty in the Dominican Republic, as well as the degrading quality of life in U.S. urban ghettos, ranging from the tapeworms and lice that infest children on farms and in barrios on the once paradisal Caribbean island, to the crack-addled nightmares of teenagers on New Jersey's inner-city streets. Dominicans of the diaspora fantasize about a better life in the United States, the imagined haven to the north that La Inca describes as nothing more and nothing less than a país overrun by gangsters, putas, and no accounts. Its cities swarmed with machines and industry, as thick with cervicales as Santo Domingo was with heat, a cuco shod in iron, exhaling fumes with the glittering promise of coin deep in the cold, lightless shafts of its eyes. The immigrants leave their children behind only to find themselves sleeping 5 to a room and working 20-hour shifts in order to barely survive in an economic system that consumes people as just another form of raw material for the gristmill of obsessive-compulsive production. The epigram to Oscar Wilde from Fantastic Four serves as a fitting encapsulation for the cynical indifference to human misery of the transnational corporate tyranny that rules the contemporary capitalist world. Of what import are brief, nameless lives to Galactus? Perhaps due to her privileged social perspective, Julia Alvarez ignores the genocide against Caribbean natives as well as the slave trade in her fiction and pays little or no attention to the plight of the poor and the struggles of immigrants. In her novel about Trujillo, In the Time of Butterflies, there's not a single mention of the tyrant's most notorious crime, the 1937 massacre of Haitians, nor is there any reference whatsoever to Dominicans of African ancestry. Instead, Alvarez's focus remains centered on her fictional persona, Yolanda Garcia, who expresses a benevolent complacency regarding things as they are, along with a self-satisfaction that at times seems almost narcissistic. What distinguishes the brief, wondrous life of Oscar Wilde from other Latin American dictator novels is that Junot Diaz portrays Rafael Trujillo as not just an idiosyncratic manifestation of purely incidental personal evil, as Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Mario Vargas Llosa, and Julia Alvarez plainly do. Marquez goes so far as to equate Trujillo with dictator types generally, including even Nero and Caligula, but rather as an all too typical, if somewhat outlandish, instrument of imperial exploitation, domination, and oppression. Trujillo, Diaz informs us, was the Foucault's high priest, the ruler of one of the longest, most damaging US-backed dictatorships in the Western Hemisphere. Trujillo was Mobuto before Mobuto was Mobuto. Trujillo makes it clear, Diaz makes it clear that Trujillo tyrannized the Dominican Republic with Washington, D.C.'s blessing, and that the man he refers to as Demon Balaguer stepped in as a more refined and polished, yet even more vicious puppet for the powerful, after decades of U.S. support for Trujillo became inconvenient to sustain. The mysterious curse that haunts the New World in Diaz's novel, the Foucault, should not, in my view, be regarded as a supernatural force at all. The baleful effects of the rapacious greed that impelled the conquistadors persist to this day in the form of devastating economic policies enforced from the neo-imperial center. As Diaz advises his readers in the opening pages, we are all caught up in the system, one way or another, even if we would rather ignore it. Although literary critics characterize the Foucault as an example of postmodern ambiguity, Diaz explicitly correlates the curse with the cruelty of predatory avarice. The arrival of the Europeans on Hispaniola unleashed Foucault on the world, and we've all been in the shit ever since. We are all its children, whether we know it or not. Simply discounting this entrapping framework as colloquial legend or idle rumor does not free us from its destructive influence. It's perfectly fine if you don't believe in these superstitions. In fact, it's better than fine. It's perfect, because no matter what you believe, Foucault believes in you. The gist of the criticism on Junot Diaz so far argues that the text of The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde continuously deconstructs and undermines itself, a conclusion that derives from the premises of what has come to be known in literary studies as theory with a capital T. This interpretive approach grounds its assumptions and precepts from post-structuralist philosophy, which are not usually explicit, because they are by now pretty much taken for granted in the field. The salient tenets of the commentary on Oscar Wilde include the contention that the multiple discourses in the novel, sci-fi, horror, comic books, animes, popular media, and fantasy, introduce a pervading sense of skepticism, that the copious footnotes constitute a counter-discourse that challenges the narrative, that the Foucault remains an ambiguous influence, a mysterious supernatural force of uncertain origin, that the text reflects Junior's dictatorial, sexist perspective rather than Junot Diaz's point of view, and that historical background should be regarded as subjectively constructed and therefore impossible to submit for verification. Critics place a great deal of emphasis on the missing book that Abelard Cabral may or may not have been writing about Trujillo's occult powers as a cause for his torture and imprisonment, even though the text's context suggests that Abelard's refusal to surrender his daughter to be raped is the more probable explanation. A general consensus has emerged that there is no coherent theme or discernible lesson in Diaz's story of Oscar Wilde, as if to suggest the novel is simply an exhibit for post-structuralist playfulness intended solely for aesthetic titillation and academic disquisition. Yet it seems to me that there is in fact an important meaning underlying Oscar's decision to sacrifice his life for the sake of love. The inclusion of multiple discourses, in my opinion, reinforces rather than undermines the urgency of the dramatic situation. Genres are a fitting lens for the extreme scenarios that unfold in the text. The footnotes likewise enhance instead of detract from the impact of the narrative, especially since they resonate with the same authorial voice. Rather than ambiguous or mysterious, the Foucault correlates from the opening pages with the avaricious cruelty of conquistadors, continuing through the abuses perpetrated by Trujillo and Balaguer, and persisting in brutal beatdowns by the New Jersey State Police. The novel, moreover, does not write itself. While Junior is certainly a character whose attitude must be taken into consideration, the line between Junior as narrator and Junot Diaz as author is by no means clearly distinguishable. Finally, the historical background that Diaz references cannot be reduced to a subjective construct, nor should all historical accounts be regarded as equivalent. The focus of the brief wondrous life of Oscar Wilde centers on overcoming the curse that threatens humanity in the contemporary world. At the outset, the author-narrator informs us, even as I write these words, I wonder if this book ain't a Zappa of sorts, my very own counterspell. Although he is tempted to rely on the Foucault as an alibi for his attempted suicide, Oscar changes his mind when he falls in love with Yvonne. Regaining consciousness after his near-fatal beating in the cane field, Oscar reconsiders the idea of a family curse. Foucault, he rolled the word experimentally in his mouth. Fuck you. Then he limps to an open window. I love you, he shouted into the street. I love you. Oscar knows full well that he will be risking his life if he dares to contact Yvonne. Although he dreads another beatdown, he nevertheless decides to defy the Capitan, who represents the Foucault that endangers everyone Oscar cherishes. In an allusion to the Hemingway short story for which the novel is named, a badly disfigured Oscar assures Junior upon his return to New Jersey, bigger game afoot than my appearance. He wrote the word out for me, Foucault. Oscar dreams of the mongoose who asks him if he wants more or less. That is, if he wants to risk seeing Yvonne again or prefers to avoid further suffering. For a moment, he almost said less. So tired and so much pain, less, less, less. But then in the back of his head, he remembered his family, Lola and his mother and Nena Enka. Remembered how he used to be when he was younger and more optimistic. More, he croaked. Oscar does not want to remain isolated and lonely, even if it means staying safe from further violence. He is not content with the idea of returning to his miserable life, teaching at Don Bosco, where he knows what he is turning into, the worst kind of human on the planet, an old, bitter dork. He understands that fear is the mind killer, which he must overcome if he wants to finally experience love. This is it, he told himself, his chance to win. Yet Oscar's transformation requires a high price. He was a complete and utter wreck, knew he loved her like he'd never loved anyone. Fuck the captain, fuck God and Grundy. Easy to say in the rational day, but at night his balls turned to ice water and ran down his fucking legs like piss. Dreamed again and again of the cane, the terrible cane. Except now it wasn't him at the receiving end of the beating, but his sister, his mother. Heard them shrieking, begging for them to stop. Please, God, stop. But instead of racing toward the voices, he ran away, woke up screaming, not me, not me. After a prolonged struggle, Oscar, The hopelessly inept, overweight ghetto nerd finally wins his battle against fear. When he dreams of the cane field again, instead of bolting when the cries began, when the bones started breaking, he summoned all the courage he would ever have, and forced himself to do the one thing he did not want to do, that he could not bear to do. He listened. Following this victory over the Foucault, Oscar looked like a man at peace with himself. He tells Clives that the ancient powers won't leave me alone, and dismisses Lola's concern for his safety because she didn't understand what was at stake. When he is led once again into the cane field, Oscar tried to stand bravely and informs his assassins that what they were doing was wrong, that they were going to take a great love out of the world, a rare thing. He told them about Iban and the way he loved her, told them that it was only because of her love that he had been able to do the thing he had done, the thing they could no longer stop. Oscar creates a Zappa for dispelling the Foucault by mustering within himself the unconquerable ancient power of uncut, unadulterated love. His selfless sacrifice for the sake of others inspires Junior to change his philandering ways. Okay, wow, okay, you win. And leaves a legacy of hope for Lola's daughter, Isis. One day she will stop being afraid and she will come looking for answers. And maybe, just maybe, she'll take all we've done and all we've learned and add her own insights, and she'll put an end to it. Put an end to the relentless destruction of the insidious Foucault. Junot Diaz encourages readers to perceive that the suffering all around us is neither inevitable nor acceptable, and that the curse of greed and violence that afflicts the human race is subject to human choice and human control. The story of our individual lives and of humanity as a whole will be written on paginas in blanco that reveal our destiny and our response to Aslan's challenge to create a stronger, loving world. That we will succeed in creating a collective Zappa, in Junior's words, is what on my best days I dream, I hope.
I've said a lot already, so I'm going to defer to either to the other committee members or to the audience at this point, and encourage questions and comments.
I can start off with a question. Well, thank you for the presentation, and thank you for letting me be on this committee for you. A question that I'm interested in, and it's strictly a question about your personal reading experience, is that as a reader, how do you feel Diaz presents the, well, specifically the Dominican experience, and maybe in a broader sense, a Latin or Latino immigrant experience in the U.S.? I ask this because I personally read Diaz as a Latino author writing from the United States. Though he is translated widely in Spanish, and I've seen him in storefronts in Peru, he is a Latino author. So kind of having in mind that he's writing for a U.S. readerly public, how do you feel that he's presenting, or what is he saying that is of importance about Latino culture in the United States today? From your personal experience as a reader who's come into contact with Diaz and had a very positive experience with them.
That's why I take the title for the dissertation from Writing into Silence. I think Diaz is unique in the literature and is a stark contrast to Julio Alvarez, for example. Julio Alvarez is widely read and very, very successful, very, very popular. And yet the view of the Dominican Republic and of the immigrant experience is very benign. You know, it's like, well, it wasn't that bad down there, really, and it's even better here, and isn't it great to be an American and be part of this culture where we can go out and just save the world? And that's the end of her, the name of her most recent novel, Saving the World, you know. And, you know, her experience as an immigrant, her father was a doctor, so it wasn't long before the family arrived here that he was able to make money, and they were able to move out to the suburbs, and she had a pretty nice life compared to the experience that Diaz describes. Diaz is talking about the brutal, gut-wrenching, heartbreaking poverty in the DR. I mean, in Drown, I picked up Drown the first time in '97. I couldn't get past the first story. It was too depressing. And I don't know what made me pick it up again in 2008, 2009, but even now, when you read about this young kid, 8 years old, you know, who's suffering from diarrhea, has only a single pencil to go to school with, and his classmates keep pushing away from him because he smells, because he hasn't got any facilities to bathe with, who eats boiled food all the time, and goes to the bathroom with diarrhea and has these tapeworms coming out. What a horrifying experience, and lice in his hair. That's what it's really like in the Dominican Republic, and you go, well, why does it have to be that way? You know, you read Galeano, you know, Galeano talks about, this was paradise. You know, when the Europeans arrived here, the Arawak Indians, very peaceful, very loving. They greeted Columbus with open arms, you know what I mean? And Standard talks about this too. What was this? What happened here? And then Diaz brings you as an immigrant to the United States, and you know, the vast majority of immigrants in this country are working in factorias, low-wage jobs. You know, Junior's father in the last story in Drown is working 20-hour days, you know what I mean, and sleeping 4 hours a night, and just a brutalizing experience. And in Otra Vida, Otra Vez, in the third book, the female narrator, who's nameless, talks about working in a laundry in a hospital, and just a brutal experience of people who can't afford to take a day off even when they have the flu. People getting killed on the job, and, you know, being severely injured on the job, and the drugs that infest the inner cities. So what a degrading experience. And for me, it was eye-opening because I had been studying Noam Chomsky previously for 20 years, you know, and Noam was talking about neoliberalism and the onset of neoliberalism in the 1970s, late 70s, and especially in the 80s, and getting worse and worse and worse. And right now, it's on steroids. It's insane. And I'm staying at the Comfort Suites down the hill, and I look at the cleaning ladies, and you know, it's like they're barely getting by. And people like me are staying in nice rooms, you know, coming in with expensive luggage. Well, not me, but the guy next door, you know. You know, I mean, it's like Lehigh itself, you know, the city on the hill. You know, you're up here, and everybody's doing just fine. But it always strikes me as ironic every time I see a safety bulletin from Ed Schuff in the email. It's like, yeah, kids, you better watch out, because people down there are starving. People down there are hungry, and they're angry, and they are going to stick a gun in your face and eat a wallet, and that's the reality. And Diaz keeps asking, does it really have to be like this? You know, I mean, aren't we all human beings? And what I admire about Diaz is he's become very successful as a publishing writer. He's making money. He's teaching at MIT, so he's very much in the center of the established classes, like Alvarez is. And he doesn't let up. He keeps pushing these issues, like this is important, this is something we need to look at. And what's even more, from my point of view, I was teaching general science in high school back in the inner city, and I got in touch with Isaac Asimov's book, Our Angry Earth, back in 1991, 92. And global warming is a huge, huge problem. And sadly, it's only in mainstream discourse now in the last year or two. But Asimov was warning about this in the early 90s. I got hip to it. I was trying to teach my students about it, but you couldn't even mention that. And even now we have to talk about climate change as if it's a natural part of a geological process. And it's not. And the science is there. just last week, the UN panel came out with the third leg of its report, saying we got 15 years to turn this around, and if we don't, it could be the end, it could be doomsday, and that's what he's warning about. You know what I mean? That's why he turns to science fiction and stuff. And personally, you know, he asked my personal reading, I always said this in class, you know, that unless we can figure these things out collectively as human beings and start a conversation, what are we going to do about global warming? You know, and what are we going to do about the threat of nuclear annihilation? This thing going on in Ukraine right now is just totally nuts, and it's all about neoliberalism. The banks investing in Ukraine, the resources backed up by the military beef. Well, we got missiles pointing at each other. We're looking at, you know, that's why I said this in my presentation. Even the sustainability of life itself is low priority when it comes to profit. That's nuts. And he's one of the few authors that I think, writing in the postmodern mode, few American writers, who's pointing these issues out and kind of confronting us with them. But beautifully, he does it with such great humor and such great style and tact and poise. I wish I could be more like that, because I get too wound up about it. But that's
Thank you.
kind of a long answer.
So I want to ask a question, Vincent, sort of that follows up on this last exchange, and thank you for the presentation, which is, as usual, very eloquent. One of the things that's very striking about your dissertation, like your presentation today, and like the comment you just offered, is that there's a kind of intensity and fierceness about your inclination toward explicitly political analysis and explicitly historical analysis. And one of the things that's very persuasive about the dissertation is you're saying, look, here's the long, painful, enormously concrete history which this book is really about, and out of which it's emerged. And I want to ask about what you make of the fact that Diaz himself is often moving away from the kind of concrete political analysis that you're so invested in. And I have two things in particular in mind. Like you argue very convincingly that the critics are wrong to think of the Foucault as a non-historical phenomenon. And I find your argument about this very persuasive. But why talk about the Foucault at all? In other words, why use the language of a curse to talk about a long political history? Or to use another, or to get at this same issue a different way? Diaz, interestingly, is not interested in representing a political mode of resistance in the domain of the novel, right? And for him, he always wants to return to these very moving, primal, emotional, libidinal responses. And so I want to ask you, given the intensity of the historicism and the political character of your own analysis, what do you make of, why is Diaz sort of, in a way, moved to use this language of the curse, which obviously other critics have read in all these other ways, and why is politics not appear within the domain of the novel? Like, how do you think about why Diaz has made those choices?
Okay, I see that three parts to that.
Mm-hmm.
The first is that he mentions in interviews that the things he's talking about are so extreme and so horrifying and so beyond imagination that he has to resort to the genres,
I see.
like science fiction, fantasy, and I think the food comes out of horror. You know, that there's this curse. It's haunting us. It's a terrible, terrible thing, something that really scare you. And by couching it in that language, he's able to magnify the idea that this is an evil that can consume us and could literally destroy us, and that it emanates from within. And you know, he mentions Twilight Zone and Anthony and the cornfield, and he compares Trujillo to that. And he says in the interviews that Trujillo was such an unimaginably horrific monster that you can't describe him in ordinary terms. You have to resort to these extreme discourses. But the critics tend to say, well, resorting to the discourse like genre automatically shows that we should regard this with skepticism, that it deconstructs itself, that it undermines itself. I disagree. I think the text itself does not show that, and he himself in his interviews says, no, that's not what this is about. The next point, I feel that he rightly, as a fiction writer, avoids a political discourse, because I don't see political discourse and fiction working hand in hand. I don't know of anyone who's really done that successfully in the history of literature. And that the more political a writer becomes, the more they end into that danger zone where they're not writing good fiction anymore. Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath treads that borderline, and I think rather successfully, but not too many people venture that far out, and Brecht did it. But then you get people like Maxim Gorky and you know, Soviet realistic fiction. It doesn't work. You know, you can't mix that up. What I like about Diaz and Oscar Wilde is he picks an overweight ghetto nerd, the most unlikely hero you can imagine, and it emphasizes just the same way that the Foucault works in a horrific way. Using Oscar as his model, as paradigm, I think underlines the idea that real change in the world, the kind we need if we're going to survive, has to begin within the individual, and that it begins with the transformation away from competition and selfishness and egotism to selfless love. And it's a big step. I mean, I feel it's a huge challenge for me to try to be more like Oscar. You know, Oscar actually literally, consciously, knowingly sacrifices his life for love. And I think it's a very profound moment in this novel when Oscar is coming out of the unconscious state where he's been horribly beaten, almost dead. He's in tremendous pain, and the first thing he wants to do is talk about his mom. He has this dream about the mongoose, and he said, it doesn't matter. You know, I risked my life gladly, and he tells Ivan that at the end, that it was more than worth it. And it's like a Christ story. You know? It's like the McMurphy story in Ken Kesey. And to me, Ken Kesey's book, Cuckoo's Nest, is terribly overlooked. That's one of the great testimonies to social justice. And what I feel on the third level with this is that Diaz is deliberately inviting a postmodernist and post-structuralist critique. He's using all those tech, you know what I mean? But at the same time, he's undermining that critique at the same time. He says the Capitan is such an evil man, not even postmodernism could explain him away. He talks about, you know, we postmodernists don't believe in things like God, you know, the transcendental signified, but that's what pulls Belly out of that cane field, Inca's prayer. You know? So I think this is a wonderfully complex text, and what really drove my dissertation was that I looked at the critics, and to a man, to a woman, they're basically saying, you know, like T.S. Miller says, she says, the lesson of this novel, if there is one, implying that there's not one, you know, that this is the pastiche, this is, you know, like an exhibition of the playfulness of language. And so naturally the Foucault is subject to skepticism. So Deep and I have a little bit of a running conversation. Because I've said to Deep, you know, I think I equate the Foucault with capitalism. You know, that in the economic system which says that I can get as much as I want for myself, and what happens to you is on you. That's not my problem, that's your problem. And to me, that system doesn't work, and in order to enforce that, you need violence, and it produces trauma and stuff. So I think some kind of socialist paradigm, and I wouldn't even use the word socialism because we don't need that. We need to find new ways to think about, you know, what can we do to make it more equitable. And even economists will tell you that if the bottom 99% are losing money and suffering more and more deprivation, the top 1% are at risk as well. They may be doing fine today, but 10 years from now, we're headed for the next crash, I mean, the next bubble. It's just not sustainable.
Vincent, it's very tempting when graduates are writing and we're looking for things beside the fiction to write about and to bring in to provide some deep context for the work. It's very, very tempting to start to read sociology, graduates will do this, history, and they'll be reading, and not writing a word, but reading. And you've done a lot of reading and putting a huge superstructure upon this novel, which is, I think, a playful in a lot of ways, which escapes, any kind of single message that you want to impose on it. How far should a graduate student go, should a writer go in creating context when we have a literary work in front of us? And how far do we stray into political realms, how far do we take it into the economic, the sociological? Are we moving, when we go into these disciplines, are we moving away from literature and kind of forcing a certain lens through which to see the literature? How do you respond to the question? You say, well, how far should I go? How many other things should I read before I can actually critique this novel?
Well, I've really pushed the envelope in that regard. I pushed it as far as I probably dared to do, and I certainly didn't want to overdo it. And if I have, then I've done Diaz an injustice. But my personal feeling about it is that we've gone too far the other direction. We look at literature as if it's separate from any other academic discipline or any other way of looking at the world, as if it's a world unto itself. And post-structuralism has invited us to do that, that we're looking at the text itself and how it interplays with itself and how language works and or doesn't work. My feeling about this is that Diaz, literature needs to find its place in the world. It needs to find a way to talk about the world. And again, going back to Cuckoo's Nest, to me that was a very powerful literary statement. It's a beautiful piece of literature. It works as fiction, but at the same time, he was making a very clear point, which is the combine is the system. And that's where I got the metaphor of the pecking order, the chicken yard, and that's a perfect metaphor for capitalism per se, because it says basically survival of the fittest, dog eat dog. If I ended up at the top, that's because I deserved it. And that's the argument that's made here on the Hill, at Lehigh. I'm here because I deserve to be here. What's left out of that is you had opportunities like crazy. So yeah, you're here, but the people you're comparing yourself to haven't even near that kind of opportunity. So how is that fair? How does that work? So what I find about him that's really beautiful is he writes a purely literary work. He avoids the political stuff. And he does not need this historical, all this philosophical, psychological, linguistic, historical, political context that I provide.
He knows it.
But at the same time, I felt it was important to put a context around the novel, because he is referring to that stuff there. And it's really important. And the critics are either ignoring that context or they're questioning it. They're saying, well, who really knows? Or maybe it just happened that way, or maybe that's just human nature, and there's nothing we can do about it. You can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. Who should say the Europeans were inferior anyway to the Native Americans? Standard says that explicitly. He said, when you look, and he's a great scholar, and other people have looked at the same material, like Chomsky in the year 501, as Charles Mann, and they're looking and they're saying, there was a lot to be said for the kind of culture we had here, and why was it destroyed? Why was it blown up? We look at modern Africa, what's going on there. That isn't human nature. A lot of that is neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism. It doesn't have to be that way. So I felt that at the risk of pushing the envelope too much outside literary considerations per se, we needed to put a larger context in it.
Situated
Yeah,
into the present.
yeah. because, you know, these short stories are very, very painful to read. And like I said, you just walk down to South Bethlehem and you see exactly what he's talking about. People walking down the street, you know, with nothing in their hands, homeless people, hungry people, sick people. And, you know, if you don't have money in this society, you can literally be left on the curbside. It's a curbside to die. And that ain't right. There's 1 billion people starving or malnourished, and we have more food than ever before. And we got people who are so insanely wealthy, they don't even know how to spend their money. Why is that? And that's what I'm trying to bring up, is aren't there ethical considerations here? You know, considerations of right and wrong, and isn't there such a thing as human rights? What about the UN Declaration? And what I get all the time when I bring that up is, well, that's your opinion. There's no way of verifying that, there's no way of grounding that, there's no way of substantiating that, and that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to bring in these other disciplines and say, look, and hoping that it'll make us as literary scholars more conversant with these other fields as well.
Do you want to make Diaz a tool for social change, his book, a tool for social change to kind of create change through this book, through the way you talk about it?
I think he's calling for it. I think he's saying we need to look at these things. And he says that explicitly in the interviews when he talks about his own writing. And the critics point out he's unique in the sense that fiction writers don't usually make themselves that available for interviews. And it's almost like he deliberately does that. Interview after interview after interview saying, look at what I'm doing. This is why I'm doing it. It's almost like he's trying to say, take another look at what I've done. Take another look at what I want. And there's this tongue-in-cheek attitude towards postmodern. You know, it's almost like a challenge to our field as a fiction writer, and a really good one, to look at our own approach to this. I called Noam Chomsky when I got home a couple of weeks ago because we had all met and we had talked about my critique of post-structuralism here. And I asked Noam about it, and his comment was that apart from literary studies, no one takes this seriously. And that kind of leaves us out of a larger conversation that's going on in sociology, history, science. And that's sad. You know, I've also noticed a lot of undergraduates don't want to major in English anymore. And I feel it's because they're not being allowed to read literature. They're being asked to read theory. You know, and with all due respect, I mean, I have a lot of respect for Derrida, but I'll be very honest with you, I can't make hide or hair of what he's talking about. You know, I read it again and again and I go, why? You know what I mean? It's
Notice you're looking at me.
No, it's like I said to Seth, you know, I defer. I don't know very much about Derrida because he can't figure him out. But I think I'm in decent company because Noam and I have been corresponding by email for years about this project because he was aware of what I was trying to do. And he said, he can't make it. He can't figure it out what Derrida's talking about either. And he and Derrida met each other and he liked Derrida. And, you know what I mean? And he wrote to me one time, he said he feels that post-structuralism is the most unfortunate thing to happen in intellectual life in the last 40 years. Well, there's got to be some way we can talk about this, you know, because I see the value in the idea of the playfulness of language, and I think Diaz does too. You know, he talks about the plasticity of language, and he blends all these discourses, and he talks about Spanish and English and his revenge on English. You know what I mean? And bringing in hip hop and sci-fi and horror, and, you know. So there's some wonderfully creative things to do and think about language. And, but we get too rigid, I think. We get too wrapped up in our own. And part of it, I want to say this finally because I'm going on too long. I remember when Dave Marsh was here, I was a freshman or first year student taking your modernism course and Dave's course at the same time, and he gave us some things to look at. And my sense of it was that literary criticism in the 20th century, following on German philology, was kind of looking for a way to legitimize itself as an academic discipline. And that theory developed out of a way of, I feel, have an impulse to say, well, how do we how do we claim a legitimate place in the academy? How can we say that we really know what we're talking about? How can we have a theory too? You know, the biologists have their theories, the physicists have their theories, you know, we need one too. And I would argue, no, we don't. We don't need theories. And in terms of political discourse, I abjure Marxism and any kind of political ideology that says, well, this is the paradigm, this is the way you have to apply it. I don't think we know how to fix this. But I think if we took a very try and see, you know, let's try this and let's try that, with a bedrock understanding of there are certain things called human rights, and we all have those. The human rights I mentioned, the right to, if you're born, you have a right to decent food, decent shelter, medical care, decent job, you're valuable. And that's a premise, and we're all human family. What happens in South Africa is affects me. You know what I mean? I think we've always understood that. Intuitively, it's just very hard to explain that, systematize it. And I think as literary people, we're stuck with that. And I don't think we should be intimidated. I think we should go boldly forth and say, yeah, we can't systematize this, we can't theorize it. We can't park ourselves next to the physics lab, but we can say things that are really, really important and open up conversation. Because unless this whole conversation starts to occur, I mean, soon, we're really perhaps doomed. Jim?
I just want to say a couple things. First of all, thank you for your presentation. Speaking as a bitter old nerd who does own that issue of Fantastic Four through Galactus.
You do?
I do. It's the Galactus trilogy. 40. Anyway, I love that you chose this work to write about, and I also wanted to say thank you for 8 years of back and forth and sparring and discussion. I think you made me a better student with your presence. As good as I can get anyway. And I just had a couple questions, and one is just really a real simple one, which is have you taught this book? And I wonder how students respond to it. And two, going back to your response to Kesey, I've not read this book, by the way. It's like one or two on my list of books I'm going to read when I can read for pleasure again. So a couple weeks. But going back to Kesey and this book, at the end of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, when the big Indian escapes, leaves the system, leaves it behind, the implication, as I read it, is we can't solve anything within the system. And I'm wondering if that's Diaz's, in your opinion, if that's Diaz's conclusion as well, that we have to break the system, we have to get out of the system to actually change anything. Does that make sense? Because you talk a lot about this neoliberal system, the capitalist system. Is that inherently broken, or can we work within it, according to your reading of Diaz?
My answer to that would be, and the same thing at the end of Kesey, that it has to begin with a personal transformation, and the personal transformation involves, in both books, a willingness to sacrifice yourself for the benefit of others, realizing that it isn't the interest of the individual that counts, it's the interest of the community, the group that matters most. But that it's not a question of breaking out of the system, it's a question of saying the system is where we are, and if it's going to change, it's going to change from within. So step one is to change within the individual person, who becomes more selfless than selfish, who becomes more loving than hating, right? And as that individual transformation occurs, it will radiate out to those in the immediate vicinity, and then hopefully further and further, that like UNIR changes, and perhaps ISIS will carry on the tradition, just as McMurphy dies, Broom changes. Broom becomes a man, he's free now, and the idea is he's going to go out and I think at the end he gets picked up by a truck that's carrying sheep, which is the image from the New Testament, and feed the sheep. So the change will come from within the system. It's not a question of dismantling the system and then starting afresh. And that's why I steer away from any kind of political ideology that says, oh, we gotta overthrow capitalism.
Right.
You know, that gets us nowhere. We're back on a theoretical level, an abstract level. I think the beauty of this book and the beauty of Cuckoo's Nest, the beauty of Catcher in the Rye, the beautiful beauty of The Great Gatsby, to me, one of the most important passages in all of American literature is the last page of Gatsby, when he says, when the Dutch sailors looked on the Long Island, he's got the fresh green breast of the new world, the last great dream of humanity, our last chance, you know, democracy, and everything the United States could have been, should have been, still could be. You know what I mean? The idea of, you know, every man is created equal, every human being is created equal, they nail equal rights. We still have that. We are uniquely free still in the world for freedom of speech and possibility. But I feel like Diaz he works with the Democratic Labor Party. He's an activist. And I think he wants to see a grassroots conversation emerge where people here in Bethlehem, maybe we can get the kids at Lehigh talking to people in South Bethlehem and saying, hey, you know, maybe we should do something about global warming. It's in all of our interests. Our kids have that air to breathe, you know, they have that water to drink, regardless of who's where and who's doing what. You know, air is air. There's no place to hide. So we start with certain common denominators we can all agree on, and then see where we can take it from there.
And have you taught it?
I haven't taught it yet, and
I'm curious.
You tried it, but how did they react?
Well, the grad students did well with it, though. I taught the undergraduates. The undergraduates found it overwhelming. I taught it to freshmen, and it was a challenge that, partly because I was annotating everything. I think with grad students, I may not have to annotate certain things, you know, that people would recognize or remember or have a sense of, but just really kind of, you know, I'm giving a lecture on Trujillo, and I'm giving a lecture on you know, on
They don't know.
the Castro comes up and Cuba comes up, and so you end up kind of doing a lot of that, and
Yeah.
at least that's what my experience of it was. They found it a little bewildering. I think the short stories might be, if I do it again with first year students, I might try some of the short stories. But there's a grad student here who was there, so maybe she might have something to say about it.
I mean, I think our class handled the novel well, and we actually had a lot of fun with the genres as well. So it's interesting that you mentioned like the play of it as well, but not to the negation of some kind of political possibility. But yeah, I think we handled the novel well. Can I ask a question that's not really just okay. To run the risk of sounding maybe heartless, you kind of argue a little bit that the novel's presenting this, like the idea of love, but specifically a sacrificial kind of love, as a way, not necessarily out of this, you say, but to move forward within the system. And I'm just wondering, since you've decided to also read the novel as a post-colonial novel, do you see any problems with the ideology of a sacrificing love, considering the context of like the ideology of empire that over time has been like, okay, well, you're the sacrifice, so you put your sacrifice on the line now and just wait a little bit, and then we'll take care of you later. You know, that kind of deferment of sacrificing either, you know, for a nation or something else. So I mean, do you see any problems with sacrificial love as the ideal if you're reading this post-colonial novel or not?
I don't, because I don't look at sacrificial love as a category unto itself. It's like the colonial says you have to sacrifice. And what the post-colonial writer like Diaz is saying is I have to sacrifice. I'm willing to sacrifice myself for the sake of my friends, you know, for their betterment. It's like Belly in the cane field is dying, she's being beaten to death, and what saves her life is the Shabin says to her, remember, think about the ones who are not yet born, your children who are to come. And that love, you know, and when she's first being beaten, she's talking to the fetus inside of her. She's saying, you're okay, and all she cares about is protecting that baby. And she's not thinking about herself. And then later Belly is thinking about her children, and Oscar and Lola are thinking about each other, and that's what eventually Junior learns that isn't about him, it's about other people, you know what I mean? So I think of it as a totally different kind of sacrifice. It's not something you're asking someone else to undergo. It's rather something you're willing to take on yourself for the sake of the betterment of the whole community. Same thing with McMurphy. Murphy could have gotten himself out of the hospital very easily by just minding his business, and he knew that. But when he saw the pivotal moment in that novel was the shock room about 3/4 of the way through, when he realized these guys are all voluntary, and they're only there because they're afraid. You know what I mean? And he decides to use himself as an example to get them to change so that they'll have a life. You know what I mean? So I really do think that the idea of, you know, we should be caring about each other. We should want to know what's happening to the 2, 3, 4-year-old down in South Bethlehem tonight. It's not enough to say that we're doing fine up here on the hill, but how's that kid doing down there? And how do we feel when it's 4 degrees below zero and we're driving by and we see homeless people out on the street? Is that okay with us? You know, how do we feel when we read statistics saying 1 billion people are starving to death right now and there's all this food? That's not okay, you know, somehow. Because I'm you and you are me and we're all together. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I'm just interested, like, because I think in the novel we have Oscar and his form of self-sacrifice, but we also have Belly who sacrifices, but, you know, her dynamic with Lola is also that, okay, I sacrifice, but I'm expecting you to, like, do this and you know, be good and, like, do these things because I sacrifice. So it's like a sacrificing love, but also with a kind of like reciprocity or demand for something as well. But you kind of argue for Oscar's like selfless sacrificial love, which I think is a little different. Like, how do you read those two slightly different versions of sacrifice?
To me, Belly is tragic, and she does not succeed in being a truly loving person.
As selfless as Oscar. Okay.
She's not, because what happens to her is she cannot control, or she can't rise above the trauma that she's experienced from a very early stage. And we know that from research on post-traumatic stress disorder. Everybody, all the principal characters in Cabral family suffer from what we would call PTSD, right? And Belly's probably the prime example. She's been beaten, she's had oil spilled on her back, she's been treated as a slave, she's been rejected in the earliest years of her life, and she comes out very, very angry. And she takes it out on her kids. She knocks the crap out of Oscar. She abuses Lola terribly, you know what I mean? But somehow, at the end, she still loves her kids, you know, and they understand that on some level. Oscar and Lola do much better, because they do love each other very much. They help each other quite a lot, and they love their mother. So they're not quite as damaged and not quite as scarred. I think Belly is a tragic figure, and I don't think she's an example of the model of selfless love. And I think you're right. I think she does demand back in ways, but I think even more than that, she takes out her rage at the way she's been treated. And that's the saddest thing about PTSD, is that a lot of times your rage and your anger is directed at your friends. You know? And it's harder for you to feel that rage and anger at the people who actually didn't harm in the first place. Because you're afraid of them, right? But your friends are not as threatening to you, so it's easier to unleash. You know, I've been struggling with those issues myself. I had really serious PTSD because I was 18 months old when they operated on my arm. I chewed half my finger off. You know, because my parents didn't come to visit me in the hospital, they abandoned me. So there are times in my life where I see everybody around me as a potential enemy and a threat. And the therapist told me a year ago up in Connecticut, he says, I can see moments in your eyes where you look totally psychotic. He says, you look same with rage. And he says, but don't be too hard on yourself about that, because he says, you're like a quartered animal and you feel you're fighting for your life. And what will help you is to realize you don't need to feel so threatened anymore. Maybe that was then, but. So I think the idea of trauma, and I like Deep's idea, the last time we talked about Foucault, he suggested that I associate it with trauma rather than capitalism. I think that's a much deeper and richer explanation. Let's look at the damage that's been done, and is it possible to heal from that damage? Because otherwise, you know, I was an inner city teacher. I had black students curse and swear at me because I was white.
Right.
You know, reverse racism. It was brutal because they were so angry. They saw me as a symbol, not as a person who cared about them. I mean, that's not going to get us anywhere, is it? And a lot of political ideology gets driven by that anger and that rage, and that's not going to get us anywhere. We have to be able to forgive each other. And really, I think that the promise of this novel is in ISIS. And the Pagina and Blanco is we don't know what book she's going to write. And it's very significant to me that Oscar's final 300 pages where he says, I think I've got it, the key to what ails us, cosmic DNA, that manuscript is lost. Why? Because it doesn't matter what Oscar learned. It's what we learn from within ourselves, and what we learn from his example.
By listening, like you said earlier, you said Oscar's a good example of the person who listens.
Yeah, and I think that's like saying we need to listen to each other, because we're very prone to listen to ourselves, to our own pain. You know what I'm saying? I think what's interesting too is a lot of the critics insist in here that Junior narrates the whole novel. And I read the novel again just a few days ago, just to refresh for this. And to me, the sections on Belly are written by Diaz, not by Junior. And the sections by Lola are clearly written by Lola. They're not written by Junior. So that itself is complicated. Who's really writing here? And like in Diaz, the last story in here, this is The Cheater's Life, A Guide to Love. The guy's teaching creative writing in Cambridge. I mean, the parallels to Diaz as a person are so close. You know, who's telling this story? You know what I mean? And maybe it's that universal self in all of us. That's why when we read this stuff, we recognize it and we resonate with it, because great literature does it. I think it, you know, Shakespeare, Chaucer, you know, you read it and you know what that's talking about. You've been there, you've done that. You know the wife of Bath.
Wish I knew
Oh, I know the way.
You know, I went out with her in high school, so I'm feeling like I know this person. How is that possible? Unless in some sense we are all the same person. That's kind of hard to explain or systematize, theorize.
Should we, other questions, other comments? Could talk informally afterwards and maybe, is that?
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Okay, all right.
Thank you. That's great.
We have a form to give you.
Yes. The piece of paper.
Signature sheet.
Yeah,
I got that.
Did everybody sign it? Did Betsy sign it?
I signed it.
You signed it, okay.
Betsy
Betsy
signed
signed
it.
it.
I think it was a exactly, yeah.
I was gonna say.
Speech, you know,
that's
you know what would be a great thing to do with this book would be to work the genres, the comic books and stuff.
Yeah.
And you know that stuff, I don't know that.
Oh, yeah.
You said that to me the first time we
Yes.
talked about this book.
And the Lord of the Rings was very fascinating.
Well, they almost read a chapter on Lord of the Rings. I told him not to write it in the end, but he wanted to write a chapter on how Lord of the Rings connects to
I
this
just
book
wanted to
too.
ask.
So.
Or maybe it's just
At
this,
least 10 times, once a